Welcome to Ryan's Running Reviews in partnership with Roadrunner Sports, and today we're taking a look at two very unique shoes. We have the On Cloudmonster Hyper and the ASICS SuperBlast. Let's run with it. Before we get started, I do want to say these shoes were provided to me by Roadrunner Sports. However, no one had a chance to preview this video, and this file synopsis is my own. I'd also like to say please leave a like on the video and consider subscribing. Here we go. Now, the reason we're taking a look at these shoes is they are both highly cushioned neutral daily trainers, great for runners that want a ton of cushioning underfoot for those longer runs, but also want a shoe that can pick up the pace as well without having to go to a plated trainer. Neither of these shoes have a plate in them, but they give you a ton of stack height underfoot and don't weigh a whole lot despite their really large midsoles. Both the Cloudmonster Hyper and the SuperBlast are first of their kind shoes for On and ASICS respectively. They're the first model series, and I'm excited to see what the SuperBlast 2 brings, as this has been out for a while now. Now, both of these shoes are on the pricier end of things. The On Cloudmonster Hyper is $220, while the ASICS SuperBlast is $20 cheaper, coming in at just $200. The SuperBlast is the thicker shoe, and by a substantial margin. It has a whopping 45.5 millimeters of stack height in the heel with an 8 millimeter drop, while the Hyper has 37.5 in the heel with a 6 millimeter drop, so a little bit less drop compared to the SuperBlast. I was quite surprised by this, but the SuperBlast is the lighter shoe. It only weighs 8.4 ounces, which is awesome because this has over 45 millimeters of stack height. You don't see that very often. And then you have the Hyper, and this isn't heavy and it's not light. It comes in at roughly the 9 ounce mark, which I think is also pretty good for an On running shoe that gives you this much cushion as well. The uppers are quite different, both in the fit and the material that was used. On the Hyper, we have an engineered woven upper. There's actually 2 layers to it. The layer you see on the outside, then an internal fabric liner which connects directly to the tongue, making the tongue fully gusseted. It feels like a very premium material. Breathability was okay. It wasn't as good compared to the SuperBlast, which has a woven jacquard upper, which is all just one thin material and has decent breathability overall. Both options fit true size for me with regard to length. However, the total volume was drastically different. On the Hyper, you have a lot more room in the midfoot and toe box. I had to pull laces quite tight to get a secure fit. Your foot has plenty of room here, so if you have a higher volume foot, I do think you'll prefer the Cloudmonster Hyper. However, the SuperBlast has a much more traditional fit, didn't feel cramped, didn't feel too spacious, felt like most other ASICS running shoes. I was quite happy with it, and for me personally, I do prefer the SuperBlast. I felt like it had a better lockdown experience overall, especially because the heel counter has a bit more structure to it compared to the Hyper, which is a little bit more flexible. It does come up very high, a little bit higher compared to SuperBlast, which did help with the lockdown, but overall I thought the volume was just a little bit too much for me, and the SuperBlast was just a better fit overall in my opinion. Both tongues are very thin and gusseted, and like I mentioned before, the tongue on the Hyper is integrated into that internal fabric liner. And then if you go to the SuperBlast, you do have a strip of fabric on the lateral and medial side which keep it in place, some foam blocks towards the top, which I do appreciate, and then as you get towards the bottom, it becomes a really thin kind of open mesh with holes through it, which is somewhat similar to the Hyper, which also has some punctured holes in the tongue. And as you get towards the top, you basically have a couple layers of fabric put together to give you some lace pressure protection. I thought both tongues did a good job. However, the big difference is the laces on the Hyper actually have these kind of silicone bits or rubber bits integrated directly into them. And they also almost kind of feel grippy, which helps the laces stay together. Now, I didn't have an issue with the laces on the SuperBlast, but either way, when testing it out, I think it actually does a better job of keeping your laces from coming untied, which was important because I had a whole lot of extra lace on the Hyper because I had to pull the shoe or pull the laces so tight to get a proper fit. So I had a lot of extra lace, and having those little silicone bits, it did help it from coming untied. And then you just have a more traditional, rather thin lace setup on the SuperBlast, and I really didn't have an issue with that coming undone. So kind of a small neat fact we have here on the Hyper, which is cool to see. And then when it comes to the midsoles, they provide incredibly different experiences, so let's break it down. The Cloudmonster Hyper has 2 different kinds of foam and no plastic speedboard at all. Most On running shoes have a full-length plastic plate, and that is not the case here. It is a plateless shoe. The orange foam is going to be Helion, the same kind we see on the Cloudmonster and Cloudmonster 2. And then the big change here is the forefoot. So this white foam is going to be Helion combined with Pebax, which they call Helion HF. This is significantly more responsive, has a lot more energy return to it. The back part of the shoe and the front part of the shoe have completely different experiences. On the back part, it's a nice soft ride, but once you get toward the forefoot, you feel like you have this really thick, bouncy, kind of dense slab of foam directly under your forefoot. And for me, this shoe I think is really geared towards midfoot and forefoot strikers, and you really want those medium to faster paced runs to happen in this shoe, because for me, when I slowed it down or if I tried heel striking a bit, it felt like the shoe kind of had a negative drop because the Helion with the large cloud tech or holes at the back part collapsed much easier compared to the front part of the shoe with Helion HF or Pebax foam. I just felt a bit more just kind of dense through the forefoot. So for me, this shoe is really intended for midfoot to forefoot strikers, and I liked it for the medium to faster paces just because when I slowed it down, I felt like the shoe kind of had, again, almost a negative drop to it. And while the Hyper doesn't technically have a plate, they're calling this white foam a bounce board of the Helion HF, which does stiffen up the shoe a little bit, but I will say it has a decent amount of bendability and is nowhere near as aggressive compared to other plated shoes, and is much more flexible and bendable compared to the SuperBlast, which for me is fairly stiff and rigid. The SuperBlast also has no plate and two different kinds of foam. The top layer is going to be Flight Foam Turbo, a really responsive material, similar to what we see on a lot of ASICS top tier super race day shoes, although I think they're on Flight Foam Turbo Plus now, but you get the picture. And then the bottom layer is going to be Flight Foam Blast Plus, the same kind of foam we see in their more typical daily trainers like the Novablast and Cumulus. And you combine all this together, you get a very consistent, very cushioned ride, and like I mentioned before, a rather stiff platform, which helps you notice that somewhat aggressive rocker geometry and helps the shoe be very stable for having such a large amount of foam to it. For me, I was surprised by how versatile the SuperBlast was, and I do think this shoe has a wider range of runs available to it compared to the Cloudmonster Hyper. It does a great job at those slower runs, and I think an excellent job when you want to pick up the pace as well. The other thing I will say is this shoe is somewhat bulky, so when you compare these two, it has a much wider platform and just feels larger overall. So if you're someone who doesn't like a bulkier shoe, you may want to go with the Cloudmonster Hyper. Now, I will remind you, this is 8.4 ounces, while the Hyper is at 9, so it's slightly heavier, but it does feel just like a massive shoe when you're using it. If we move on to the outsoles, you do have more surface area on the SuperBlast, and with the Hyper, they did fill in the middle section, so it's harder to pick up acorns, rocks, and whatnot. I'll also say because of these Cloud Tech units, it does squeak a bit more. It's a louder shoe in general, but otherwise I thought the traction on both was fine. It is some fairly thin rubber, but for the most part I thought it gripped the ground in a decent manner. So overall, when it comes down to it, I do think the Cloudmonster Hyper delivers a more unique ride. It's a tale of two halves. The back half feels very traditional, and then you get to the forefoot, and that Helion HF or Pebax mix delivers a ton of energy return, feels very responsive, and honestly feels more responsive compared to the SuperBlast forefoot despite having less stack height. Again, if you're a forefoot runner, I think you'll really like this. It delivers just a really, just a fun and dense experience underneath your forefoot with a nice level of pop. The SuperBlast, on the other hand, is my personal go-to out of these two shoes. It's a little bit cheaper, it's lighter, gives you more cushioning, and a more consistent ride from heel to toe, plus just feels more versatile. You can use it on your slow runs, and it does fine at those faster paces as well. Well, that concludes the review. Let me know down in the comments what direction you want to see On and ASICS take these rather special running shoes. I would love to hear from you. I'm Ryan from Ryan's Running Reviews, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Thanks.